Oh, okay. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good
Hi, Rabbi.
afternoon.
So, I guess the appropriate thing to say would be Shalom Aleichem, right? Okay.
Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem shalom.
Aleichem Shalom, right?
Right.
Um, the writer. So, what I'd like to do is give you some background and context. Many of us think that, oh, Shalom Aleichem, I know that's Tevye, and the Tevye stories in Fiddler on the Roof. So I'll try to put that into context. But there's some background information that I hope will be helpful, and then we can read the story and schmooze a little bit, or if you have questions, I'll try to answer. So Shalom Aleichem today, and then actually he's Yud Lamed Peretz, or YL Peretz. We'll talk about next week, and probably one of the most famous stories that there was an off Broadway production of it. I don't think there's ever been a cinematic production of the bunch of the silent bunch of Schweig, of that. But we'll talk about Peretz next week. But today is Shalom Aleichem, that who some people refer to as the Mark Twain of Yiddish and Jewish literature. Um, so historical background, and then some other just cutesy things about his life. He was born in 1859 in the Ukraine. I won't try to pronounce the name of the little town that he came from. His father was a fairly well-to-do merchant for the first couple of years of his life, and then the family fortunes took a downturn. But the family name was pronounced Rabinowitz, as opposed to my family name, that was more from Romania rather than from the Ukraine. In Romania, it was pronounced Rabinovich. We're not related, but it's spelled the same, but Rabinovich or Rabinowitz. In Ukraine, they pronounce it closer to Rabinowitz. His father's name was Nachum, the Hebrew name Nachum, and the son was Solomon, or Sholem, if you will, Sholem Rabinovich, in that sense. The father, as I mentioned, was a merchant. He was fairly well known in the town, and then they moved to some other little towns within the larger Pale of Settlement of Russia. But the father was fairly well educated, also, and he was a believer in the movement that was known as Haskalah. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the movement that's Hasidism, okay, as a way of trying to encourage and give hope to the peasants, and the ignorant, but I don't mean that in a negative sense, but the uneducated, what they call the Amaratzas, the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. And again, if you try to picture or visualize the townspeople in a Fiddler on the Roof, either in the movie or on a Broadway production, you know what we're talking about. But as opposed to those who were the adherents of Hasidism, there were those who followed for any number of reasons, and that's for a different discussion when we talk more about the history. The movement is called Haskalah. Now, some of you may know the Hebrew term, or even the Yiddish term, seichel. Seichel in Yiddish is common sense. Jeanette's going like this. Okay, do you have good seichel? It's common sense. You have good brain functioning. But Haskalah as a movement really would be better translated as enlightenment. It was recognizing that modernity, modern scholarship, modern literature, biblical scholarship and criticism, those all had validity even within the context of traditional Judaism. So there were those who felt that they were enlightened and they belonged to the movement called Haskalah. And coming out of Haskalah also comes the re-emergence or the resurrection, if you will, of the Hebrew language. You know, Eliezer ben Yehuda, who decides to resurrect the Hebrew language, and that then goes hand in hand with the movement with which we're all familiar of Zionism. Zionism that starts in the second half of the 19th century. And goes, but it began as a cultural and educational movement with the development of Hebrew language, and comes out of this Haskalah, enlightenment kind of approach. So Sholem Aleichem, or Sholem Rabinovitz, his father was a follower of Haskalah, as loud as I get it. As well as
Fran. Does she keep popping? Fran keeps popping up. She's making noise.
Oh, okay. I see her there. Okay, there she is. All right. So the father was a believer in Haskalah, so he sent his son Sholem, or Solomon, sent him to Cheder. Cheder is the one-room traditional Jewish schoolhouse, where you learned Aleph Bes, and you learned all the prayers and whatever. But he also went to Gymnasium, which was the public school. So Solomon, or Sholem, had an appreciation. That doesn't mean that he liked it so much, but he had an appreciation of the traditional Jewish as well as the secular and public type of education, because of his father's commitment to Haskalah and the Enlightenment. So originally, as he grew up, Sholem wrote in Hebrew out of deference to in respect to his father, and many of his earliest writings reflected not only the Haskalah, but reflected Zionism, and Zionism as a way of the way out, if you will, or the ultimate dream, not so much the messianic dream, but the political dream of the peasants, the Amaratza, the local people who were facing the pogroms and the anti-Semitism of the shtetl and of Eastern Europe and the Pale of Settlement. When he published his first work in Yiddish as opposed to Hebrew, he used the pseudonym of Sholem Aleichem rather than Sholem Rabinovitch. And he did that so that he wouldn't embarrass his father, or he wouldn't bring some kind of repercussion from his father. So the father didn't even know that the first Yiddish story that his son published was actually in Yiddish. Why did he choose the name Sholem Aleichem? Well, certainly we all know that phrase, which is "peace be unto you." We tend to associate it more with welcoming each other on Shabbat, but really Shalom Aleichem is a generic peace be upon you. And some of you, when I said it before, Shalom Aleichem, some of you answered Aleichem Shalom. So if Shalom, peace be unto you, to you may there be peace, would be the traditional answer. But in the lingo of the shtetl and of the Eastern European experience, Shalom Aleichem wasn't just a Shabbos greeting, and it wasn't even the formal peace be unto you. It was closer to what we would say today of what's up, or what's new, or how you doing. It might have been said with a period or an exclamation mark, but it was meant with a question mark. Okay, it was an opening of conversation. It was an empathetic statement of, I'm interested in how you are. I'm interested in what's going on with you. The Hebrew, not so much in the Torah, but the Hebrew from earlier generations is Hashalom lecha, Hashalom lach. Is there peace with you? What's really going on? What's going on with your life? So the Shalom Aleichem starts to write these stories. Many of them are in the first. He's the narrator. Many of them are in the first person, and he's describing or he's providing answers to the people of the shtetl. The Tevye stories, and we have a 2-volume collection in the temple library. Well, actually, it's on my desk right now, but it's normally in the temple library of the collected works of Shalom Aleichem. Don't think that that's all that his works, because there's like 26 volumes totally if you collect all of his work. The Tevye stories might be 1 volume of that. But there are many other letters, monologues, confessions, and then stories, shorter stories, the kind of which is the Yom Kippur story that we'll be looking at in a few minutes. He's described as writing the voice of the pious Jew, the individual rather than the whole group. His voice is described as, and I'll need to spend an extra minute on this for those of you who don't know the phrase. His is the voice of the Shlamazel. Okay, now Shlamazel, you could kind of figure it out if you look at the word. It's a combination of 2 words, shalom, but again, not peace, is what's going on with. And what's mazel? Mazel is luck, right? Okay. Actually, mazel is the constellation in the skies. But and somebody else could talk about why we use the word to refer to luck, like mazel tov to good luck. But a shlamazel is one, actually is the opposite. A shlamazel is someone who is always unlucky. It's not, it's one of these reverse words. A shlamazel is someone who is not shalom mazel, is not filled with mazel. And what's the opposite of a shlamazel? Anyone know? A shlemiel, right? Okay. A shlemiel is someone, again, there's the first part of the word. I'm giving you your first Yiddish lesson for those of you who don't know. So a shlemiel, first part of the word is shalom also, but again, not peace, but what's up with you, what's happening with you, what's in your world, etc. And meal is short for milah, for a word. Okay, so in a word, what's happening with you, and the word is always also, it's the opposite of what you'd think it would be. Is someone who's always saying the wrong thing, someone who no matter what he says does something different. So the old joke coming out of the Borscht Belt and the Catskills is whatever. How do you tell the difference between a shlemiel and a shlamazel? Right? The shlemiel is the waiter who drops the hot soup as he walks past on the shlamazel. Okay, trying to bring something that's good and winds up being bad or problematic. Okay, so Shalom Aleichen's literature certainly has comedy and satire, but it also, and again, we know this a little bit from the way that they play it in Fiddler, but it also has rabbinic teaching. quotations from the Torah, quotations from, which Tevye says, as the good book says, right? Okay, as it is written in the good book, but also from rabbinic literature, from the Talmud and from the Midrash and whatever. But as Sholem Aleichem includes it in his work, it's almost always misquoted. It's almost always used incorrectly, sometimes to show the buffoonery of the character, but usually also to kind of make fun of the ultra Orthodox, the pious, those who were so committed to reading every word and quoting every word literally. So he's kind of poking fun that way. He has insights into the piety and the traditions of those who were the ultra Orthodox. And yet we can read, whether it's explicit or whether it's implicit and implied, we can read a lot about the shtetl and about life and how the average person approached their Jewish tradition, Jewish law, etc. The Hasidic stories that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks were magnifying and glorifying. Look how great my Rebbe is. Look what miracles my Rebbe could do. Whatever. This material kind of enforces the goodness, the sweetness, the menschlichkeit of individual Jews, even if they didn't have great wisdom and great background and knowledge of the traditional literature. I want to quote one article that talks a little bit about it from a scholarship point of view, if you will. The writer is Hillel Halkin, Halkin, who's I forget where we somewhere in New York, City College or whatever, used to teach there, and did a lot of translating, both of Yiddish and of Hebrew works. So Halkin says Sholem Aleichem, his world was precisely that of a large majority of the 10 million Jews confined to the Pale of Settlement, that huge ghetto of Western Russia that was forced by the systematic anti-Semitism of Tsarist regimes to live in a daily shadow of frightful poverty, pogroms, and the whims of a tyrannical bureaucracy. Many of Sholem Aleichem's characters, who generally live on the brink of ruin and often tumble over it, were to be his personal lot too. After an adolescence of grinding hardship, he married the daughter of a wealthy Jewish landowner in 1883. He inherited the family fortune 2 years later when his father-in-law died, and then promptly lost every penny playing the Kiev stock market. He borrowed more money from his wife's mother and lost that too, and spent the rest of his life writing at a breakneck pace. All 28 the editions of his work and whatever run to, like I said, 26, 28 volumes. All of this in an effort to support his wife, 6 children, and his mother-in-law. Okay? Blows of fortune were no doubt what gave Sholem Aleichem, even at the height of his fame, his extraordinary ability to empathize with the sufferings of ordinary Jews and to project that identification to them. He was the troubadour of the poor. His humor is redemptive, never escapist. It lightens by bringing to light. Its laughter is not that of contempt or of embarrassment or even relief or sympathy. Rather, his humor is of understanding and acceptance. So that's the scholarship, or the critics' words about Sholem Aleichem. He left Russia in 1906, lived in Germany for a few years, then came to New York trying to seek his fame as a playwright, but wasn't really successful at that point, and went back to Europe for a few years, then came back to New York in 1914. He was already suffering from tuberculosis at that point, but in those years in between, from 1906 to 1914, was when his stories, his columns, his books of confessions is what they were called. It's when they really flourished, and he became known worldwide in the Jewish community. When he first came back to New York, 1914, there was an open house for him at Carnegie Hall for him to read some of his stories. When he performed, in a sense, traveling all over and reading his stories at bookshops and in libraries, not so much in synagogues necessarily, but places again like Carnegie Hall. One of the things that people point out was he always stood. He never sat down when he was doing a public reading, and he didn't. When he would be telling a story, and if he started laughing, he would just continue to laugh and continue to read. If he started crying, he would continue to cry through that. He never just said, please give me a moment to collect myself. He just continued to be human in his delivery. At that time, the traditional Jewish community referred to him as a 20th century, and here there are two other names or two other titles with which some of you might be familiar. One is a 20th century Maggid. Now we encountered the term Maggid 3 weeks ago, talking about the Hasidic, the storytellers. The purpose of the storyteller was different. For the Hasidim, it was to particularly tell a story and teach a moral lesson. For Shalom Aleichem, to Maggid, to tell the story was to remind people, especially in the New World, of what their brothers and sisters, cousins, uncles, and aunts were enduring back in the old world. And for a sake of empathy, if not even, although he wasn't necessarily known as a fundraiser, but there's certainly someone might stand up after he did his reading or did his storytelling and say, now, the Jews back in Kostravelka, the Jews back in Ukraine would really appreciate our help. The Jews who are involved in the new Zionist world and trying to make the first Aliyah could use our help. So while he didn't necessarily do the fundraising, but the occasion of having so many people together was used by those other organizations on his behalf. So he was the 20th century interpretation of a Maggid, of a storyteller, but also they referred to him, like I said, one of the critics the English word was a troubadour, but in the Jewish community, they referred to him as a metargaman. Now, the metargaman comes from the word that means to translate. So again, we'll go back into our history, that the classic sacred text of Judaism, the Torah, the Tanakh, the Bible, was all in Hebrew. Okay? But most of the people did not know Hebrew. They spoke Aramaic, or they spoke a little bit of Greek, or they spoke Ladino, or they spoke whatever. And then in more recent times, they spoke Yiddish. They knew a few words in Hebrew, but they didn't really understand all of the Hebrew, which was the Lashon HaKodesh, which was the holy language. So the Metargaman would stand literally next to the Baal Koreh, the one who would be reading, or with Torah, chanting the Torah in services, or the Matargaman would stand next to the rabbi or the teacher who was trying to give a lesson. Today we would call it a sermon, a lesson about Jewish tradition, or how to, we got Hanukkah. So what are some of the particular customs about Hanukkah or Pesach or Yom Kippur, whatever it might be? The Matargaman would translate it into the ordinary language, the vernacular, so people would understand. So they use the same term in referring to Shalom Aleichem, that he was translating from those who were, those who were born in New York, those who were living now comfortably, maybe not even comfortably, but were living in the new world, but those who had forgotten, or those who really didn't know the world of the shtetl, and they needed someone to translate it, to bring it into life. So that's why they used that title for him as well. Anyway, between 1906, 1914, 1915, he becomes world famous. So many of his stories and whatever are published. He was working for a daily Yiddish newspaper in New York. His assignment was 200. I'm sorry, two columns, as it were, or two stories each week. The name of the paper was Der Tag, the daily, if you will. And he was paid in 1914. He was paid $100 a week. He was that popular. $100 a week for two stories each week. Okay. He performed all over the world. His readings, standing room only, as I mentioned. Marc Chagall, the artist, refers to a time back in Russia when Shalom Aleichem came to town to read stories. You couldn't get in without a ticket. Chagall couldn't get a ticket, so he talked specifically about climbing a tree to overlook the courtyard where Shalom Aleichem was going to be reading a story. And one of Chagall's paintings specifically was inspired by that particular moment. Shalom Aleichem died as I mentioned, he had contracted tuberculosis. He died in 1916, age 57. There are photographs from his funeral, and it was described as the largest funeral in the United States since the funeral of Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
Somewhere between 100 and 150,000 people attended the funeral. He's buried in Brooklyn. And again, someone described showing his popularity. There are people at the funeral, shows people with derbies, fedoras, Hamburgs, bonnets, worker caps, and streimels. The streimel is the fur cap of the Hasidic. I mean, more than 100,000 people attended. His work has been translated into more than 40 languages. Fiddler on the Roof alone has been performed in no less than 25 different languages around the world. And in conclusion of this background, I quote to you, not so much from Fiddler, but I quote to you from one of the stories where Shalom Aleichem speaks, or Tevye speaks Shalom Aleicham's philosophy. Okay? Quote, as long as a Jew lives and breathes in the world and hasn't more than one leg in the grave, then he mustn't lose faith. Okay? So that's Shalom Aleichem. That's the background. Before we read the story, anyone have any questions or anything based on what I said? Hi, Gail.
Yeah, was he a Zionist?
Well, he was a Zionist in principle. He supported Zionism, but he certainly, to the best of my knowledge, he did never come out and say that all Jews should live in Palestine. He was supportive of the movement. There was one essay that I remember reading years ago. You know, the big thing in early Zionism was the tension between the political Zionists and the cultural Zionists. Today, we might say between the democratic and liberal and the Orthodox, the right wing, the settlers, on the other. But when Zionism first started, the end of the 19th century, the second half 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, you have the followers of Herzl, who believed that there should be a democratic state in which Jews could live, and live freely and live as moderns, or whatever modern meant in the second half of the 19th century, or the followers of people like Achad Ha'am, Asher Ginsburg, who talked in terms of cultural Zionism, meaning a Jewish state, that all the decisions, all the laws should be based on Jewish culture, at least, if not Jewish law. If I remember correctly, and again, I could try to look it up, but Sholem Aleichem did publish an essay where he aligned himself more with the cultural Zionists rather than the political democratic Zionists. But again, I'm not familiar with anything where he said, and I intend to move there, or I intend to come and pick up a shovel and a hoe and clear the land. Marcia, was that a question?
Yes. What is the background of the song that we sing, Shalom Aleichem? How did that come to be that it's in all the prayer books?
Well, I don't remember.
Name.
I don't remember
have any relation to him?
I don't remember the composer offhand. It should be easy enough to find out. But the Shalom Aleichem, in the way that we have it in our prayer book for Friday nights, for example, is based on a legend in the Talmud that and I apologize, this is a little, the explanation here is a little sexist, but of course the men were at the synagogue and the women were at home preparing the house for Shabbat,
Right.
and that as the men were walking home from the synagogue, and again, we have to put this in Talmudic time, so it's really not a synagogue, and it's and don't think of putting things in the microwave or whatever, but that as the men are walking home from the synagogue, they're accompanied by the Malachei Hasharet, by the ministering angels, and the angels are kind of debating as to whether or not the balabosta, the mama back at home, if she has done a good job of preparing Shabbos at home. If the chicken has been prepared and the house is cleaned and the lights are, the candles are ready to be lit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one angel says, "Oh, I'm sure that she's not ready," and the other angel says, "Of course she's ready," and da 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 da. And when the father, the husband, when he enters his house and he sees that the house is beautifully set for Shabbat, then the one angel who had been supportive says, "Aha, thus may it be this week and next week and every Shabbat to come." But if something wasn't correct, the husband opened the door, and he's got his guests, the ministering angels, and he's embarrassed because Mama hasn't prepared for Shabbos correctly. Then that angel says, "Thus may it be for this Shabbat and all the Shabbats and all the Shabbats." So it's okay. Thank you for accompanying me. Shalom Aleichem, ministering angels. Boachem, come in peace. May you leave Seitchem l'shalom. May you go in peace also, because obviously the confident answer is that all of our wives, all of our Jewish homes will be properly prepared. But that's the origin of the phrase and the song.
So it has nothing to do with him.
No, it has nothing to do with this fellow's, with this writer's name, other than it was a familiar, just those two words of Shalom Aleichem, again, meaning how are you? What's new? What's up?
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I just wanted to share that recently on PBS, there was an entire show about Fiddler on the Roof
Uh-huh.
and how it was, and they showed, I don't know if anyone saw,
Right.
they showed it performed all over the world, different
Right.
languages and the people in the cast. And it was just phenomenal how, worldwide it is. And it was wonderful. Wanted to share that.
Back in Detroit, I had the experience over my years there of probably 4 or 5 times of coming in to inner city high schools where the drama club or whatever was going to perform Fiddler, and to come in and speak to these kids and talk to them about what all the different customs were and what it means, and and make sure that you don't touch, and and all of these fascinating kind of thing. But yeah, the like I said, it's been translated, been performed in more than 25 languages.
Amazing.
Not counting how many different countries.
Yeah,
Right.
it was great.
All right, so let's look at this. Let's look at the story. I'll be glad to be the reader, because I think that excuse me, I dropped my papers. I want to put the correct inflections here, and I apologize. Ruth Ann knows how much we struggled with this. The book that we copied this out of, when it came out, so I think you see it like in 2 columns, right? A left-hand column and a right-hand column. Okay, so I had to do some cutting and pasting with that, because the way that it first came out was all of the left-hand column for 6 pages you had to read, and then go back to the right-hand column beginning on page 1. So I'm not sure why it was that way, but we had to cut and paste. So I think we got it correct, where it didn't throw anybody off. Irving Howe, some of you may know that name, a collector and a scholar and a teacher. I want to say Harvard, but maybe not. It was the writer of that little introduction there on the page where it says a Yom Kippur scandal, and in the middle of his little paragraph, what one learns along the narrative journey matters more than the final destination. Again, so the difference between Shalom Aleichem or next week Yud Lamed Peretz and their goal of writing the story is different than the goal of the Hasidic Rebbe or the Maggid or whatever that we were talking about for two previous times. They're the moral lesson, or the fact that each of us can play a role. Remember the one that I was talking about, that this is where the Messiah looks back at you and says, no, it's, don't ask me what I've been waiting for. I ask you, what have you been waiting for? Why hasn't the Messiah come? Why haven't you been doing what you should be doing to allow the Messiah to come? Why do I have to be the one to do this? And to empowerment as well as religious sensitivity. But Shalom Aleichem and this genre of the Yiddish literature is, the narrative journey matters more than the final destination. Is come along on this journey and picture yourself in this conversation. Picture your parents, your grandparents, Picture the people whom you see on the stage in the town. What's the town in Fedya? And Anatevka, as opposed to this, which is Kasravelka. Picture yourself as part of this. Now, just one last aside. Sometime, whether we do it as a group and we have this opportunity, or whether if you have it, you have the notion on your own, look at the literature that's called the stories of the people of Chelm, Chelm. Now, Chelm is actually a real town, but the people of Chelm are all, I don't know what to say. They're all good-hearted, but they do not have the seichel that we were talking about. Okay, they don't have the common sense. Okay? So one very, very simple example, I'm just telling it off the top of the top of my head, is that one of the important buildings in the town of Chelm burns down. They have a fire. It burns down before the volunteers, the fire department from the next town, because Chelm doesn't have its own fire department. So before the volunteers from the fire department, the next town can get there, the blaze is lost. So the mayor of Chelm, it's not a rabbi, the mayor of Chelm says to the people from the town next door, have you ever had a tragedy like this? And they said, no, we don't have a tragedy, because whenever someone sees a fire, they know to ring the bell, and the fire department comes and they put out the fire. So the mayor thinks, aha, how are we gonna, we have to learn our lesson so that it doesn't happen again in Chelm. So what does he do? He goes out and he buys 100 bells and gives a bell to everybody in town. And sure enough, there's a fire, and people start ringing their bells, but nobody comes to put out the fire. Okay. So that's Chelm, and they're beautiful, beautiful, beautiful stories. No real moral lesson there at all. Just enjoying and picturing yourself in a town where nobody has the right answer. Okay, and if there's a visitor from Warsaw, or a visitor from Vilna, a visitor from somebody else, and all he can do is just oy vey, at dealing with these people from Chelm. Anyway, Yom Kippur scandal. Here we go. That's nothing, called out the man with round eyes like an ox, who had been sitting all the time in a corner by his window, smoking and listening to our stories of thefts, robberies, expropriations. I'll tell you a story of a theft that took place in our town, in the synagogue itself, on Yom Kippur at that. It's worth listening to, okay? So Sholem Aleicham's style is, again, he's the narrator. It's as if all of these incidents happened to him in his world, in his town, in his shtetl, to his family, and he wants all of us to come along and relate to it. Our town, Kasrelevka, that's where I'm from, it's a small town and a poor one. There's no thievery there. No one steals anything for the simple reason that there's nobody to steal from, and nothing worth stealing. Besides, a Jew is not a thief by nature. Again, the Hasidic story would say, here's why you shouldn't be a thief. Okay? Sholem Aleichem is saying already, there are no thieves here. Okay? He may be a thief, but not the sort who will climb through a window or attack you with a knife. He will divert, pervert, subvert, and controvert, I don't know all those words in Yiddish, as a matter of course. But he won't pull anything out of your pocket. He won't be caught like a common thief and led through the streets with a yellow placard on his back. Imagine then a theft taking place in Kasrelevka, and such a theft at that, 1,800 rubles at one crack. Here's how it happened. one Yom Kippur Eve, just before the evening services, just before Kol Nidre, a stranger arrived in our town, a salesman of some sort from Lithuania. Now, pause for a minute. Somebody from Lithuania is called a Litvak. Okay, a Litvak. Someone who from another part of the Pale of Settlement, called, for example, Galicia, is called a Galiciana. Okay, and if you think that the arguments between the Hatfields and the McCoys in American literature are crazy, then you ain't seen nothing yet until you see the literature or the jokes or the stories about the Galicianas versus the Litvaks. All right. So if you remember the story we were talking about with the Hasidic about the one rabbi, all of his students are saying our rabbi is so fantastic. He goes to heaven every Shabbos, goes to heaven every Shabbos. The one who can't believe that, doesn't accept it, needs to be convinced, is a Litvak. Okay, and so it's the Litvak who follows the rabbi and sees him go and chop wood and brings food and medicine to an impoverished lady out in the forest. And then the Litvak comes back and has to say to the other followers, when they say, well, did our rabbi go to heaven? And the answer is no, he went even higher than heaven. So there's that story, but it's the Litvak who's the skeptic. The Litvak is the one who never really understands anything. The Galiciana are a little more aristocratic, if you will, in the normal way of telling the stories. But then there are not only the Litvaks and the Galicianas, but there's the Romanisches, that's my family, the Romanians. Then there's the Polish, and then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all these different things. Sometimes they'll make fun of each other. Sometimes it's just mentioned here, right, in kind of in passing, but it may be because, as we're going to find out, that the Litvak is really not such a great person. But well, he doesn't make Shalom Aleichem doesn't make much of that anyway. So the stranger comes to town. He's a salesman of some sort from Lithuania. He left his bag in an inn and went forth immediately to look for a place of worship, because it's Kol Nidre. It's the right before Yom Kippur. And he came into our old synagogue. Coming in just before the service began, he found the trustees. Those are the leaders of that's the board of trustees, although they didn't have a board of trustees like we do today. But he found the trustees standing around the collection plate. Some synagogues certainly used to pass a plate around for tzedakah, for charity before this. It has to be before the service, obviously, because you wouldn't be carrying money with you during the service. So you'd empty your pockets before the service started, and they would collect it. Shalom Aleichem, he said. Aleichem Shalom, they answered back to him. From where does our guest hail from? From Lithuania, he answers. And your name? Even your grandmother wouldn't know if I told her, but you've come to our synagogue. Some of them wanted to play Jewish geography, okay? Or they wanted to test whether or not he's legitimately Jewish, okay? Why? I mean, doesn't mean that the doors were closed to non-Jews, but maybe if he had a little bit of, if he had some parnasa, if he had some money to give to tzedakah, maybe we could offer him a high honor in the synagogue, to open or close the doors of the ark, or to hold one of the Sefer Torahs, to hold a scroll, and he would make a nice donation. So it's not just, what's your grandmother's name? Do we have the same hichas? Are we maybe related? Do we know each other? But they're also trying to find out whether or not he has the material resources to be able to help them. Okay. You've come to our synagogue. Where else should I go? He says. Then you want to pray here? can I help myself? What else can I do? It's Yom Kippur. It's called Nidre. Then put something into the plate. What'd you think, that I was not going to pay? He says, well, to make a long story short, our guest took out from his pocket 3 silver rubles and put them in the plate. Then he also put a ruble into the cantor's plate, 1 into the rabbi's plate, 1 for the cheder, 1 for the school. He threw a half a kopek into the charity box, and then he began to divide money among the poor who flocked to the door. In our town, we have so many poor people that if you really wanted to start giving, you could divide Rothschild's fortune among them. We have so much need here. Impressed by his generosity, the men quickly found a place for him. Where? Tevye's, what is Tevye? What, if I were a rich man, I'd have a place on the eastern wall, right? Where did they find room for him when all the places along the wall were already occupied? Don't ask. Have you ever been at a celebration, a wedding or a circumcision, when all the guests are already seated at the table? Suddenly there's a commotion outside because the rich uncle has arrived. What do? You push and you shove and you squeeze until a place is made for the rich relative. Squeezing is a Jewish custom. If no one squeezes us, we squeeze each other. The man with the eyes that bulged like an ox's paused, looked at the crowd to see what effect his wit had on us, and he went on. So our guest went up to his place of honor and called to the shamus to bring him a praying stand. He put on his tallis, because you do wear a tallis on Kol Nidre night, and he started to pray. He prayed and he prayed, standing on his feet all the time. He never sat down or left his place all evening long or all the next day of Yom Kippur. To fast all day, standing on one's feet without ever sitting down, that only a Litvak can do. Okay? But when it was all over, when the final blast of the shofar had died down, the Day of Atonement had ended, and Chaim the Melamed, that's the learned one, the Chaim the Melamed, who had led the evening prayers after Yom Kippur from time immemorial, had cleared his throat, and his tremulous voice had already begun Ma'ariv Aravim. That's the evening prayer after the end of Yom Kippur. Suddenly, screams were heard. Help, help, help! We looked around. The stranger was stretched out on the floor in a dead faint. We poured water on him, we revived him, but he fainted again. What was the trouble? Plenty. This Litvak tells us that he had brought with him to Kasrelevka 1,800 rubles. To leave that much at the inn, think of it, 1,800 rubles, he had been afraid. Whom could he trust with such a sum of money in a strange town? And yet, to keep it in his pocket on Yom Kippur was not exactly kosher either. So at last, this plan had occurred to him. He'd taken the money to the synagogue, slipped it into the praying stand. Only a Litvak could think of doing something like that. Now do you see why he had not stepped away from the praying stand for a single minute? And yet, during one of the many prayers, when we all turned our face to the wall, someone must have stolen the money. Well, the poor man wept, tore his hair, wrung his hands. What would he do with the money gone? It was not his own money, he said. He was only a clerk. The money was his employer's. He himself was a poor man with a house full of children. There was nothing for him to do now but go out and drown himself or hang himself right here in front of everybody. Hearing these words, the crowd stood petrified, forgetting that they had all been fasting since the night before. It was time to go home and eat. It was a disgrace before a stranger, a shame and a scandal in our own eyes. A theft like that in our shul, in our synagogue, 1,800 rubles, and where? In the Holy of Holies? In the old synagogue of Kasrelevka? On what day? On the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur? Such a thing had never been heard of before. Shamus, lock the door, ordered our rabbi. We have our own rabbi in Kasrelevka, Rab Yosefel, a true man of God, a holy man, not too sharp-witted perhaps, but a good man, a man with no bitterness in him. Sometimes he gets ideas that you would not hit upon if you had 18 heads on your shoulders. When the door was locked, Rab Yosefel turned to the congregation, his face pale as death and his hands trembling, his eyes burning with a strange fire. He said, "Listen to me, my friends." He probably started off by saying, "Shema Yisrael, listen to me. This is an ugly thing, a thing unheard of since the world was created, that here in Kasher there should be a sinner, a renegade to his people, who would have the audacity to take from a stranger, a poor man with a family, a fortune like this. And on what day? On the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, and perhaps at the last, most solemn moment just before the shofar was blown? Such a thing has never happened anywhere. I cannot believe it's possible. It simply cannot be, but perhaps, who knows? Man is greedy. And the temptation, especially with a sum like this, 1,800 rubles, God forbid, it's great enough. So if one of us was tempted, if he were fated to commit this evil on a day like this, we must probe the matter thoroughly. We must strike at the root of this whole affair. Heaven and earth have sworn that the truth must always rise as oil upon the waters. Therefore, my friends, let us search each other now, go through each other's garments, shake out our pockets, all of us, from the oldest householder to the shamus, not leaving anyone out. Start with me. Search my pockets first. Thus spoke Rab Yosefel, and he was the first to unbind his gabardine and turn his pockets inside out. Following his example, all the men loosened their girdles and showed the linings of their pockets too. They searched each other, they felt and shook one another until they came to Lazer Yosel, who turned all colors and began to argue that in the first place, the stranger was a swindler, that his story was the pure fabrication of a litvak. No one had stolen any money from him. Couldn't they see that it was all a falsehood and a lie? The congregation began to clamor and shout. What did he mean by this? All the important men had allowed themselves to be searched, so why should Lazer Yosel escape? There are no privileged characters here. Search him! Search him! The crowd roared. Lazer Yosel saw that it was hopeless. He began to plead for mercy with tears in his eyes. He begged them not to search him. He swore by all that was holy that he was as innocent as this as he would want to be of any wrongdoing as long as he ever lived. Then why didn't he want to be searched? It was a disgrace to him, he said. He begged them, have pity on his youth, not to bring this disgrace down on him. Do anything you wish with me, he said, but don't touch my pockets. How do you like that? Do you suppose we listened to him? Wait, I forgot to tell you who this Lazer Yosel was. He was not a Kasser Levkite himself. He came from the devil knows where. The time of his marriage, he came to live with his wife's parents. The rich man of our town had dug him up somewhere for his daughter, boasted that he had found rare nugget, a fitting match for a daughter like his. He knew 1,000 pages of Talmud by heart and all the Bible. He was a master of Hebrew, arithmetic, bookkeeping, algebra, penmanship, in short, anything you could think of. When he arrived in Kasser this jewel of a young man, everyone came out to gaze at him. What sort of bargain had the rich man picked out? Well, to look at him, you could tell nothing. He was a young man, something in trousers, not too bad looking, but with a nose a trifle too long, eyes that burned like two coals, and a sharp tongue. Our leading citizens began to work on him, tried him out on a page of Gemara, that's a page of the Talmud, a chapter from the scriptures, a bit of Rambam, that's Maimonides, this, that, the other. He was perfect in everything, the dog. Whenever you went after him, he was home. Reb Yosefel himself said that he could have been a rabbi in any Jewish congregation. As for world affairs, there's nothing to talk about. We have an authority on such things in our town, Zadel Reb Sheis. But he could not hold a candle to Lazer Yosel. And when it came to chess, there was no one like him in all the world. Talk about versatile people. Now, again, sidebar. Think of that description of what was going on in the shtetl. You know, what was important? It was important that someone knew not only Torah and Talmud and things like that, but they're amazed to hear someone who knows arithmetic. Here's someone who knows geometry. Here's someone who knows world affairs. Here's someone who knows how to play chess. Isn't it? You know, forget the movie that's on Netflix or whatever right now. Was there any indication of anything so cosmopolitan as being able to play chess in the shtetl, in the little world of Eastern Europe, in the Pale of Settlement? Naturally, the whole town envied the rich man his find as a son-in-law, but some of them felt he was a little too good to be true. He was too clever. Too much of anything is bad. There's your moral lesson for the day, right? For a man of his station, he was too free and easy, a hail fellow well met, too familiar with all the young folk boys, girls, and maybe even loose women. There were rumors. At the same time, he went around alone too much, deep in thought. At the synagogue, he came in last, put on his tallis, and with his skullcap, his yarmulke on askew, he thumbed aimlessly through his prayer book without ever following the services. No one ever saw him doing anything exactly wrong, and yet the people murmured that he was not a God-fearing man. Apparently, a man cannot be perfect. And so, when his turn came to be searched, and he refused to let them do it, that was all the proof most of the men needed, that he was the one who had taken the money. He begged them to let him swear any oath they wished, begged them to chop him, roast him, cut him up, do anything but shake his pockets out. At this point, even our rabbi, Reb Yosef, although he was a man we had never seen angry, lost his temper, and he started to shout. "You," he cried, "you thus and sus. Do you know what you deserve? You see what all these men have endured. They were able to forget the disgrace and allowed themselves to be searched, but you want to be the only exception. God in heaven," that's the Yiddish, "Ribono shel olam, either confess and hand over the money, or let us see for ourselves what is in your pockets. You are trifling now with the entire Jewish community. Do you know what they can do to you?" Shalom Aleichem comes back as the narrator. To make a long story short, the men took hold of this young upstart, threw him down on the floor with force, began to search him all over, shake out every one of his pockets, and finally they shook out, well, guess what? A couple of well-gnawed chicken bones and a few dozen plum pits still moist from chewing. You can imagine what an impression this made, to discover food in the pockets of our prodigy on this holiest of fast days. Can you imagine the look on the young man's face, and on his father-in-law's, and on that of our poor rabbi? Poor Reb Yosef. He turned away in shame. He could look no one in the face on Yom Kippur in his synagogue. As for the rest of us, hungry as we were, we could not stop talking about it all the way home. We rolled with laughter in the streets. Only Reb Yosef walked home alone, his head bowed, full of grief, unable to look anyone in the eyes, as though the bones had been shaken out of his own pockets. The story was apparently over. Unconcerned, the man with the round eyes of an ox turned back to the window and resumed smoking. "Well," we all asked in one voice, "what about the money?" "What money?" asked the man innocently, watching the smoke he had exhaled. "What do you mean, what money?" "The 1,800 rubles. "Oh," he drawled, "the 1,800, they're gone." "Gone?" "Gone forever." And
He probably gave them all away. Remember, he was given to the poor.
he gave it all. He gave it all away.
Yes.
Gave to tzedakah when he came in, when he was asked to make a donation in the plate.
And he
Right.
kept giving and giving.
So it wasn't his money. It was the money that he was carrying.
Mhm.
Okay.
I'm thinking it didn't exist. It was all, he came from outside. He caused all this commotion. And it's like, the outsider came in, the guy from Latvik,
Litvak, yeah.
Lithuania.
Lithuania.
Say that again? How do I say it?
A Litvak.
I
It's
got it
from
backwards.
Lithuania.
Litvak, Litvak.
Right.
Right. So it's like, boy, look at the chaos and how they turned against each other because somebody like planted this seed or this rumor and wow. Yeah, that's how I see it.
Okay,
Yeah.
Ricky.
I see it as so totally different. The money wasn't important. It was more important that somebody broke the fast on Yom Kippur. That was what was the ultimate crime here, not the money. Money's easy, but you can't have a bone and cherry picked in your pocket on Yom Kippur.
And because he's a stranger and because he's a Litvak, he certainly couldn't accuse somebody of doing that. So he had to come around the outside, if you will. Bobby, was your hand up?
Yeah. Hope no one holds it against me, but I'm a Litvak. My
Don't
grandfather
hold it
was
against
great.
you. That's all right.
Of course not.
Thanks, Cher.
But
Is this mystery solved?
Are you familiar with? I mean, have you ever heard things about, the Litvak versus the Galiziano, this and that?
No, my grandfather never really spoke of it. He had left
Okay.
very fast when he and my grandmother left Russia, left Lithuania. They left the night they got married.
wow.
A policeman
okay.
had come to him to the wedding just to tell him that he better leave very fast because the police were coming for him. The army was coming for him the next
Wow.
morning to put him in
Smart
the army.
Litvak.
He would be gone.
Whoa.
Okay.
And so they carried what they could on their backs and all and
Sure.
left and found their way here to the States.
Right. And it's amazing to think how often that story must have been repeated. How
Oh, yeah.
many people were in similar situations. Right.
Mhm.
Well, it was a sort of a terrible thing if your intermarriage one was a Litvak and one was a Glitziano. And I
Yeah.
can't remember, my parents were different. I don't know what they were. But that was the story that I always heard. They would ask
A marriage between it was the same as in the south of the U.S. Of an interracial marriage or something. It just didn't happen.
They would ask the guys that came to take you out what they were, and usually they didn't know. They were
Uh-huh.
Jews, but they didn't know. In 1950, we didn't know a lot of that.
No. With many people had lost track. Right. Share what.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
And then David, I saw he had his hand up.
Okay.
What? Oh, good. Now, give me a second. Where did my thought go? Oh, I know what it was. At the end of the story, isn't it interesting that the rabbi who then responded to all this and, made the guy shake his pockets and all that stuff, he was the one that was in shame and alone because he had, he was the one that got into it and like, oh, well,
So
they all stepped forward.
Speaking of my colleague,
Yeah.
okay, my rabbinic colleague, is he more embarrassed and ashamed at the fact that that someone was humiliated in his presence, or that one of his congregants, one of his students, had done this ultimate sin of eating in the synagogue on Yom Kippur? Which do you think was his source of shame?
The latter.
Okay,
Just
David,
that
I
he
know
was eating.
was it you or Wendy that would have the question?
It was me. The Lithuanian, or I guess the Litvak, was he just testing this very poor village of very honest people to see if they were all truly honest men?
Could be.
I mean,
Or indeed he could be a swindler. He was trying to swindle people, and he didn't know about the one fellow who had had the crumbs in his pockets. He was hoping that what they were going to do was they were going to take up a collection
Election.
and replace the 1800.
See the answer to his test.
Fran?
Yeah. And I also
Oh,
wanted to
I'm
add,
sorry, David wanted to still say.
yeah, I wanted also to add that there's a personal aspect of that story that my father always carried with him a sandwich to Yom Kippur.
Uh-huh,
Always had it in his pocket. And the reason is that he was a diabetic and he
right.
could not fast. And according to the law
You
and
can't-
the tradition, he was allowed to do that. What wasn't good was that
If I
mom,
may, David, if I may,
yeah,
it's not that he was allowed to, is that you must.
Must.
yes,
Right.
he must.
You must, if you're taking medication or whatever that you need to be eating or maintaining your sugar or whatever, you must eat it. Not that you are allowed to.
Yes. But the other thing was that mom insisted on putting peanut butter sandwiches in a bag in his coat pocket. And so everybody around him was just going nuts. Who was carrying around peanut butter sandwiches? So
Uh-huh.
she chose something a little better. Thank you.
Okay, Fran?
Well,
My-
isn't there's a third
Oh,
possibility.
I'm sorry, we have two Frans, huh?
Fran.
Which
Okay.
Fran? Okay, am I speaking?
Yeah.
Fran Orak, you
Okay.
are. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, there's a third possibility that the rabbi was mortified that he had embarrassed someone
I think
in
so.
that way, humiliated someone.
True,
Yep,
true.
yeah.
Okay.
Because there's rules against that.
So do we think that the theft actually occurred?
No,
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 No one does. Okay.
no, uh-uh.
Even though he says at the end, he says, but where's the money? It's gone forever.
Yeah, he may not have
Because
had
it
it in the first place. I
But
mean,
he
he
gave
could
away
say
up.
whatever. Look at what he said. So like, you're gonna believe him? I just want to add something and
Please.
that is when I heard this story, David was talking about his personal, experience. What I will share is that in the realm of temple, I had an experience which this reminded me of without going into details, which was something bad had happened and my name sounded similar to somebody else. So did the person come and gently ask? No, they like slammed it on me. Did you do this? And immediately, instead of, immediately I'm like, whoa. And what I got back was somebody who, let's say, took their power not in a healthy way. And it was like, if I was told, if you don't answer this and tell me you didn't do it, I assume you did. And I went, whoa. So I'm just saying I can relate from that piece of it that, what all is really going on behind the scenes. So that's what I have to say.
Okay.
Okay.
Bobby and Marcia?
yeah, I'm gonna go back to what I said earlier, is any money that might have been there when he came in and they asked him to donate, put something on the plate for tzedakah, he did. And he gave to so many other charities within the temple right there, the rabbi, to the chazan, to the poor people. Any money he had that he admitted was not his money to begin with was probably totally given out.
Yes.
Mhm.
So he
He gave away everything.
so he then made up the story and
Yeah.
orchestrated the whole thing. So he'd have,
That's my
when he
feeling.
got back home, he could tell his employer. Right. Okay.
Mhm.
Marcia?
I think that in his standing all the time, his eyes didn't always go on the Torah. He maybe saw this man eating, and therefore he said, what can I do or say to have him to have everybody known that this man did it? And money isn't important. This is the most
Right.
important thing. So he's told us, he
Right.
made them
and
think
yet,
of that when he
Right.
said the last line, that was what we are you know, especially on Yom Kippur, how we have to be truthful and loving to each other.
Mhm. And yet, you know, you might see underlying the whole story is the accusation that, with apologies to Bobby, but that the Litvak didn't hesitate to, you know, to accuse or to have, you know, have the local guy to have him be embarrassed, you know, and whatever. You shouldn't, you know, he shouldn't be causing embarrassment. He shouldn't
Right.
be singling him out, but only a Litvak would do that kind of thing, right? You know, you had that.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Outsider.
I made
An
apologies first.
I mean,
That's-
my grandfather was the one, no one ever did anything wrong. He had a reason for everything, anyone he ran up on. And he ran when he came to Buffalo, New York, when he finally moved there, and he had a bar/boarding house. He found no bad in anyone. People
Yeah.
didn't have the money to pay for the night. They still got a
Right.
room.
Sure.
But that's the outsider, the xenophobia, I think.
Yeah, to a
Yeah.
certain
Part of
extent.
it.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Right. So I want to leave you with a small world story. It really has nothing to do with nothing to do with this, other than just remarkably coincidental, and that despite the fact that we feel so far removed from each other, and we see each other only in these little boxes on the on the computer, or rarely we might see each other personally. So a member of the temple, actually, Gary Friedman, who some of you
Mhm.
know, Gary and I actually go back to 1962.
Wow.
We go back that far. But he gave me the name of someone, and it didn't connect with him at first, of the name that he was sharing, but a fellow to consult about a particular issue, and the fellow's last name is Roman. So I called. We played a little telephone tag at first, and Mr. Roman, this is Mr. Roman, and we're calling back and forth and back and forth. And Gary Friedman gave me your name and whatever. And so when we finally, he called me back, and he had a little bit of an accent, but not much. And and he said, well, we got to talking about where the origin of the name Roman. And I said, well, I thought I made the assumption that he was Italian Roman. I said, well, no, actually mine is, it was Rabinovich, and that we're from Romania. And when they came to the New World, where are you from? We're from Romania. Okay, you're going to be Roman. That'll be, because he can't spell Rabinovich. Anyway, so he says, Romania, where in Romania? And the fellow's not Jewish. I said, well, actually from a small town in the north is when my grandparents were born. And he said, what's the name of the town? I said, Berlad. And he said, oh, that's only about 10 miles from where I grew up. And I said, well, when they went from Berlad, before they left Romania, they lived in Iași, and that's actually where they were married. And Iași is spelled Iassi. And he said, yeah, that's where I went to college.
Oh my God.
Oh, gee.
And I was just, and he kept the name Roman. It was Roman from back in Romania. My family changed their names, but even so, I mean, I'm not even sure where he was talking from, somewhere in the States. But it is a small world, and we are interconnected in ways that we can only imagine.
True.
So,
Thank you.
any last questions or comments or stories? Next week, like I said, we'll do Yud Lamed Peretz. One of my favorite stories is Bunch of Shvaik. Yes, David.
Yes, I just wanted to give you a little bit of our weekly poem. Two very short poems today. One of them is from a famous one that we're all familiar with when we watch someone who is at the end of life, Dylan Thomas. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And the other one is from Jules Bergman, the late reporter from ABC News, on the launching of the world's first communications satellite, Telstar, in 1962. He had 5 words to say that may be relevant to all of us. And it all began today.
Well,
Right.
tomorrow night we have a service at 7 o'clock.
Yep.
Okay.
And
Saturday morning is Torah study.
yeah, and tomorrow, just so everybody knows, hopefully Maridel is going to be at the helm. So I'm gonna just,
Okay.
so not that I'm that much of a professional, but we're going back to where I was in July. So be patient, everybody. It
We
may
will
not
all, we will all be patient.
But you're gonna be there,
as
right?
what my practice has gotten. It might even be better.
Are you going to be there?
Yes,
Okay.
If it's
Okay.
better, you're a good teacher.
yes, yeah.
Right.
I will be there because I
Right.
have stuff for you, Ricky.
Exactly why I'm asking, but I didn't.
Yeah, I will
Yeah.
be there. I will be
Rabbi,
there.
I've totally enjoyed the last 3 weeks. I don't know if I'll be able to get on tomorrow because we'll be down in Cabo San Lucas next week.
We'll
We
have
are
a good,
bringing a
safe
laptop
trip.
with.
Be
Yeah,
very, be
have a
very
safe
We
careful.
will be careful, but it's the
Yeah.
only way I can get Jack off the computer from work is to actually go away somewhere.
Okay.
Otherwise, they find him.
All right. Well, we'll hopefully we'll see all of you again before first night Hanukkah, which is a week from tonight.
Good
And
night.
we'll talk more about
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Right.
Happy and healthy Hanukkah. Stay safe, everyone.
You too.
Thanks.
We'll see you
Same
next,
to
Thank you very
everybody.
much.
at the next
Thank you,
gathering,
everybody.
Thanks, Rabbi
See you
Norman.
soon.
next
Thank
Zoom.
you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
See ya. Have a good
Bye.
week.
Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.